Jon Jones. Hearing that name may bring a surge of different emotions to UFC fans. On one hand, he's one of the greatest fighters that's ever fought in the octagon. On the other, he's one of the most troublesome individuals Dana White has ever worked with as well. Here are Jon Jones' most insane moments of his career, good and bad in no particular order. Number 1. His TKO win over Vladimir Matyuchenko, good. A young and upcoming Jones was making his way to stardom in the fight game. However, people questioned if the lanky fighter could handle himself against the real heavy opponents. The heavier the fighters become, the less skill is involved, and attributes like endurance and power are favored above all else. In 2010, Jones' victory over Matyuchenko was the shot heard around the world. Jones was a real threat in any weight class. Matyuchenko was a former lightweight heavyweight champion, and Jones was able to dismantle him in less than 2 minutes. He's simply a better grappler and wrestler. Once Jones got on top, he unleashed a flurry of devastating elbows that earned him the stoppage in just 1 minute 52 seconds of the first round, with Matyuchenko's arms pinned down, leaving Jones an opening directly to his face so early into the round. There was no room to question if the fight should have gone any further. He could have dealt some permanent damage if he wasn't stopped. Number 2, a not-so-glamorous moment in his career, bad. In 2012, Jones was arrested for a DUI. In one of the earliest moments of his career, Jones began a long road of controversy. Jones ran into a pole with his Bentley Continental GT in Binghamton, New York. Jones paid a $1,000 fine after pleading guilty. He also got his license revoked for 6 months. All things considered, it could have been worse. In New York, some DUI violations can result in a year of jail time. Despite his apologies, the MMA community would still strongly criticize him. It would also be a moment that springboarded his many run-ins with the police and car-related incidents. In 2016, he also got pulled over for drag racing and proceeded to calling the police pigs. I'm sure that made things a lot better. Don't worry, this is among his more tamed controversies. We've got a lot more where that came from. Jumping forward a little in time, don't worry, we'll get back to the other stuff too. Number 3, we got his second fight against Alexander Gustafsson to reclaim his throne. Good. Johnny Bones was the enemy of the UFC at this point in his career. He had a plethora of controversies and recently came off another failed drug test after getting his belt stripped from him 18 months before this fight. Thanks to his reputation, however, he was given an immediate title chance. Gustafsson was a familiar opponent that some argued actually beat Jones in their first matchup. He was a well-respected fighter that had a reasonable claim that he was the best in the fight game. Jones said otherwise. In 3 rounds, Jones was able to take apart Gustafsson with his superior striking, keeping Gustafsson at a distance with a mix of kicks and punches. It was a total dismantling, and even Gustafsson knew it. After the fight, the two fighters could be seen shaking hands and laughing. Gustafsson obviously had nothing but respect for Jones and has gone on record to say that he was picked apart during that fight. I guess real recognizes real. 4. Alright, back to the bad stuff. Remember back in 2012 when UFC 151 was cancelled? Bad. Well, originally Jones was supposed to fight against Dan Henderson for the main event of UFC 151. Unfortunately, Henderson had torn his MCL. Although this fighter tried to work through the pain, it eventually became too much for him to handle. Dana White later revealed that it was Jones to blame. Another fighter named Chael Sonnen was ready to step up to the plate, but Jones turned down the fight altogether. This earned a polarizing reaction from UFC fans. While some understood why Jones didn't want to fight a different opponent so last minute, a greater majority blamed him for the cancellation of the event. They branded him a killer of the sport, staining Jones' reputation even more with yet another controversy in the same year. 5. We got Jones versus Daniel Cormier in 2015. Good. Jones and Cormier have zero respect for each other. Unlike how Jones and Gustafsson can beat the brakes off each other but shake hands at the end of the day, Cormier and Jones would continue at each other's throats if they could. Cormier, a former multi-belt champion, has a plethora of reasons for hating Jones, mostly due to all the controversy surrounding Jones along with Cormier's long tragic history with car accidents, a recurring blemish in the lifestyle of Jones. This pure animosity between the two led to an extra aggressive and extra violent fight that made for an epic highlight reel. In the end, Jones did win by unanimous decision. This was marked by a lot of UFC fans as the catalyst for one of the most intense intense rivalries in the UFC ever. 6. 2016 failed drug test for UFC 200. Bad. Jones was supposed to compete in UFC 200 but failed his drug test, resulting in a 1-year suspension from the sport. He had failed a drug test before UFC 182. Back then, it was for cocaine and it was not revealed till after the fight. This time, the stakes were too high to wait until after the fight. UFC 200 had the makings of a legendary night. Jones was taking on nemesis and then undisputed champion Daniel Cormier in a rematch. In another card, Brock Lesnar returned to the ring. There was a women's bantamweight title fight and interim featherweight title fight. It was stacked with fighters and could have been the greatest pay-per-view of all time. That is until literal days before the fight, Jones was taken off the card, testing positive for clomiphene and letrozole. This may have been the biggest controversy of his career yet. 7. Despite his many controversies, we gotta give him some props. He is still undefeated in title fights, and he's still the youngest champion the UFC has ever seen. Good. In a surprising turn of events, Jon Jones destroyed Shogun Rua to become the youngest champion ever. Jones was supposed to be bait for Rua. Nobody expected him to actually win the fight. It was meant to be a step up for his career, not an actual title victory. Shogun Rua was an established MMA legend, but what happened that day was perhaps one of the most brutal beatdowns the UFC has ever seen. Punches, kicks, knees, elbows, and everything in between. He became a champ that night and hasn't lost since. 8. Another failed drug test. Bad. In UFC 214, right from the jump after his suspension from UFC 200, the controversial fighter had come back to reclaim his title against Daniel Cormier in a knockout victory. He went on to the mic and told all the fans he turned a new leaf and promised a better future. All that hype came to a screeching halt when he tested positive for tironidazole, an anabolic steroid. As a result, Cormier retained the title and Jones was again banned, this time for 18 months. After this suspension, it was unclear if he'd ever be allowed to fight in the UFC ever again. The only thing that saved his career was yet again his reputation. If any other fighter had committed this many violations, they would never see the inside of the professional ring again. Jones, however, is too much of a great fighter and way too famous to sideline, so of course he came back. 9. The legendary fight between him and Gustafsson in UFC 265. Good. This was his first rematch against him, and it turned out to be one of the greatest fights of his career. The two heavyweights duked it out all the way until the 5th round. Gustafsson didn't pull any punches and gave the champion everything he had in the arsenal. By the end of the fight, the two were bloodied and hurting badly. Nobody was really sure who won that fight, and there was reasonable speculation that Jones' reign at the top was over. In the end, there was a controversial unanimous decision victory for Jones. It's highly regarded as an all-time favorite for fans. Both fighters ended up in the hospital pretty hyped about the work they put on each other though. It's why they respect each other so much. Last but not least, we gotta talk about the most insane and most controversial part of his career. In 2015, Jones had a hit-and-run incident. Very bad. This was a defining moment in Jones' career. It's probably the worst thing a fighter has ever done outside of the ring. His popularity took a serious nosedive after he ran from the scene of an accident when his car hit 2 other cars. One of them had a pregnant lady in the vehicle. When the car was searched, they found a marijuana pipe, and some speculated that he was high at the time of the incident. This is the moment he was labeled a villain by the UFC and suspended indefinitely. For someone so invincible, it seems like his biggest weakness is himself. With that wraps up the video. Thanks for watching. See you again next time.